Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, our first session in our series titled Shaking Up Small Cities, Conversations on Repurposing, Remodeling, and Repositioning of Pennsylvania's Communities. Today is session 1. My name is Michelle McKenna. I am the Membership and Marketing Coordinator for AIA Pennsylvania. And before we get started, I'm going to cover a couple of the logistics and housekeeping pieces of this session before I kick it off to our speakers. This webinar is being recorded. A recording will be shared via email 1 hour after the session ends. That'll come in directly through GoToWebinar. A post-webinar survey will also be shared at the end. It should pop up on your screen as soon as we conclude. So please let us know how you enjoyed this session. It really helps us to plan for future events. This course has been approved for 1.5 AIA LUs. If you are an AIA member and you included your member ID during registration, I will log your credit for you. And then if you have questions, drop them into the chat function or the questions bar, and we will review them at the very end. If you have any questions about logistical things, just send me a chat and I can answer that for you, but you can expect that survey and that recording to come out at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jeff Paspa, AIA Pennsylvania's 2021 president, to introduce our panel.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. And we're really excited about this panel. We've spent the last couple of months really figuring out how to put this together and really provide a great content service that we see happening throughout the state. And this is part of a broader citizen architect initiative that we're working on at the state level, where we have architects who are serving in capacities that go beyond kind of the traditional role of the architect that when people think of designing buildings. And we have architects who are on boards that are making decisions about policy. We have architects that are like Tim Carney is a state senator. We have architects that are serving in their communities, and this is an effort to highlight some of the work they're doing. So Stephen Glickman, as you read, is someone who's been involved in his community in a role that, again, is beyond the traditional architectural role, with historic preservation engagement and planning commission engagement. But we also are thinking about how, as cities grow, and particularly this panel is focused on 2 regions of the state that have experienced the most growth. The census that was just released in 2020 showed that Lancaster and the Lehigh Valley region were 2 of the fastest growing areas of the state. And as we want to see what are the challenges that come with that, with infrastructure, with building, it's always great to be in a position of growth, but how do you manage that? And we think that architects are one of the stakeholders as part of that, among many. And it's not just developers, it's not just architects. There are, as you'll see in this, there's city planners, there are city officials, there are directors of economic development. There are other agencies that are really seeing this growth happen, and we really want to highlight that as case studies about how these 2 regions have managed it, and that how other regions, whether you're a city to a small town throughout the Commonwealth, can find something, I think, to borrow a phrase from the Philadelphia Citizen, ideas that you can steal. We hope that these are things that you take back to your communities, and you can either talk to your state senator, your legislators, or just your local officials who say, like, hey, I saw this idea about how to attract new investment, how to pull together a group of diverse stakeholders and manage the growth we're experiencing in a positive way. And to that end, we also have Amul Maruki. Michelle, if you could go to the next slide. She is our Director of Legislative Affairs, and she is kind of our face of kind of on the ground speaking to legislators. And she'd like to talk more about what her role is, so that if you have specific questions after this about how we are kind of engaging throughout the state, both in legislative and community engagement affairs, that she's our point of contact. Amul?
Great, thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you everyone for being here. Like Jeff said, I am Amul Maruki. I am the Director of Legislative Affairs and Chief Lobbyist here in Harrisburg is where I'm based for AIA Pennsylvania. A little bit about AIAPA. We represent close to 3,000 architects in the Commonwealth. And this is not about me, but I do want to let you know that we do have a robust government affairs committee. Most recently, we started a housing and community development subcommittee that's going to focus a lot on the policy initiatives and the legislative front of housing and community development. So a lot of the things that you're going to hear about today in this presentation. We also have a building code subcommittee, education and school construction, committee on the environment, historic preservation, that also deals with a lot of other tax credit issues and incentives, disaster assistance, and licensure. We also have task forces that focus on public-private partnerships, practice encroachment, and legal reform. So if you have any questions, if you want to get involved, or I want to thank all the legislators, legislative staff, AIA members, and allied members that are on this webinar. If you have any questions about any of these issues or anything else, please get in contact with me. I think that my contact information is on the next slide, and I would be happy to chat with you or provide any resources that you might need. We have a lot of subject matter experts in every one of those fields, and we just want to be a resource to everyone, to all of our allied partners, stakeholders, and elected officials and legislative staff alike. So thank you for the time, and please enjoy Shaking Up Small Cities. Jeff, back to you.
So as a series, and we actually think that there's the potential that we turn this into a broader series, depending on maybe some of the feedback we get here. I think Amal was even saying that she's run into a couple of people and would like to see you know, a focus on their city or town throughout the state. So, you know, we're going to start here. We have 2 panels set up already, and it's a cross section of, again, of the stakeholders that we're seeing managing growth throughout the state in areas that are both growing and some that potentially have a region that is in decline population-wise, but have still managed to find a way to eke out growth and investment. So that'll be phase 2. But for this first phase, you know, we have Darlene Heller, who is the director of planning and zoning in the city of Bethlehem. Stephen Glickman, who's an architect, among other things, and he'll be the moderator. He has his own architectural practice, but he's the one who's also engaged as a citizen architect in multiple capacities, notably the vice chair of the Lehigh Valley Planning Commission. And I'll let Stephen introduce himself and some of the other things he's engaging. So I think it's a long list. And then Jeremy Young, who's the director of community and economic development in Lancaster City Alliance. But who also holds many hats. You know, when we talked about this, I think the list of boards and organizations he's involved with really spans the spectrum in Lancaster. And if there's anybody, you know, you need to know what's happening in Lancaster City, or potentially the county too. I think it's the broader region. Jeremy's really one of your resources in that area. So I'll let them each introduce themselves, and they're going to have a small introduction slash of themselves and their region and area, so we get to know, you know, Bethlehem, you know, Easton, Lehigh Valley region a little better, and Lancaster a little better.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. And thanks for including me in this. There really is a lot going on in the Lehigh Valley, where Bethlehem's located in the heart of that, and we have seen a lot of growth and advancement in the last several years. So yeah, managing that is really the challenge. Could you go to the next slide? This is just a quick and dirty view of where we're located on the eastern edge of the state of Pennsylvania. Our population is a little more than 75,000. We've been steadily growing in population for the last 20 years. I think what we're mostly known for is the fact that we used to be the headquarters of Bethlehem Steel, and much of our story for the last 20 years really has been reuse of that site and trying to integrate that site with the rest of the city. Can you go to the next slide? And one of the things that makes us maybe unique from other cities is that we do have 2 downtowns. We're divided by the Lehigh River. On the north side is the Northside Moravian Historic District. Sometimes that's what people think of when they think of the city of Bethlehem, our historic downtown. It's quaint, it's beautiful. It's been a historic district since 1961. On the south side, the downtown is much more eclectic, and the south side that's also where the Bethlehem Steel plant was located, and south side therefore has been always more blue collar, more diverse, more ethnic in nature, and that's reflected in a lot of the characteristics of South Bethlehem. The south side is anchored with Lehigh University's main campus, Packer campus, to the south of downtown. And just to the north of the downtown is the Steel Stacks campus. That's the core of the steel site. We call that Bethworks or Steel Stacks. Right now it includes the visitor center. Actually, you could go to the next slide. I think I show that in more detail. We've restored the oldest building on the site to be the regional visitor center for South Bethlehem. The iconic blast furnaces are really the core of the redevelopment that's taken care of there. The Levitt Pavilion is to the front. That we hold 50 free concerts every summer there. It's an outdoor plaza. It's a great gathering area. Music Fest is run by Arts Quest here, and it's headquartered in both of our downtowns. But the Southside core of Music Fest here is at the Steel Stacks campus. Arts Quest headquarters are there. We've constructed the Hoover Mason Trestle, which is really our local high line. We took the line where they would actually move raw materials at the steel site and turned it into an elevated pedestrian way. We did receive some awards for that. We spent a lot of resources and energy to really rejuvenate that site. And really at the core of it, it's arts and culture. And that's one of the initiatives that we have for rebranding the city. If you go to the next slide, we are also trying to reuse a lot of those leftover buildings from the steel into new and innovative uses. To the top left is PI, which is the Partnership for Innovation. It's a small business tech incubator. It's been up and running for about 10 years. We have support for that through a KIZ, a Keystone Innovation Zone. We partner with Lehigh University for that program. To the right is another example of an adaptive reuse of a Bethlehem Steel building. It's just called The Factory, and it's an incubator for food, beverage, and pet food small businesses that are starting out. It was initiated by the man that started Pet Brush and sold that company and invested in this incubator. So that's been hugely successful for the south side of Bethlehem. And what we're finding is a lot of the workers in these facilities are really getting apartments and living and investing in South Bethlehem, which is really what we want to see. In the bottom left is just a conceptual. There's another building, Lehigh Riverport, which is was converted into a large number of condominiums and some commercial space. And that'll be our public marketplace coming in 2022. If you go to the next slide. One of our branding initiatives is for the South Side, the Arts District. And we run it like a Main Street. It's not a Main Street program, but we do run it like a Main Street. In the top right, we have a lot of leftover vacant parking lots that used to be filled with Bethlehem Steel workers walking to work. And so we're trying to infill those lots little by little. It makes a connection between the Steel Stack site and the downtown. In the top right corner is an example. It's 510 Flats. We have design guidelines. We have historic districts. I think that our role in the city really is to try to manage development, to get good design, to get design that fits in with the fabric of the existing community and really infills some of those gaps that we have along our main corridors. We have an ambassadors program. We invest in really the face of the South Side. And we've tried to be innovative with arts in the South Side. And the bottom right, you see a competition we had for artistic bike racks. And we've really tried to create a new face for South Bethlehem. If you go to the next slide. One of the things that we're also working on is, because our downtowns are separated, is walkability, bikeability, improving transit infrastructure. We work on infrastructure, but we also work on education, and we have partners in everything that we do. So there is a nonprofit, CATS, the Coalition for Appropriate Transportation. Our Health Bureau has an initiative for bike and ped safety. And this is just a photo from a recent rally that we've had for biking in Bethlehem. And it's a growing initiative. We just completed a corridor study for Broad Street, one of our main corridors on the north side, for bike ped and transit infrastructure. And it's really what we think is a huge component of quality of life in Bethlehem. If you can go to the next slide, please. And on the north side downtown is very different than south side. It's been a historic district since 1961. I think that's when the state of Pennsylvania initially even allowed historic districts to be created. And it's really been a huge economic driver for the downtown and also for the neighborhoods surrounding the downtown. It's one of the most popular, I guess, neighborhoods in the city right now. Our downtowns have been very successful. The bottom left photo really shows what we tried to do to be responsive during COVID to allow our restaurants to really survive. The parklets were extremely successful last summer, so much so that they had to be collected during the winter. They can't stay out through snow, et cetera. But we rebuilt them this year, and it looks like, with the success that we've had with them, we'll be doing this probably on an ongoing basis, because the public really enjoys the outdoor dining. It used to be an issue to take away on-street parking, and it really isn't anymore. The outdoor dining is much more important. Another initiative that we're working on the north side is World Heritage designation for our north side Moravian community. It's really integrated in the downtown, and it really puts us on the map. It's a long process to get the designation, but it is something that we're working for. We have found that arts and culture and tourism and historic preservation are a great combination. They're really economic drivers for both north side and south side, and they're really putting us on the map in a variety of ways. So we have been able to really find some success with each of those. The mayor likes to refer to us as a city of festivals, and we have festivals, basically as often as we can, and they tend to bring people in. People enjoy being in the urban core, and I think that that's probably something that Easton and Lancaster enjoy as well. I think that might be my last slide. I have one more slide, actually. This is the Goodman building, and it's really just, it's not the most significant redevelopment site that we have, but honestly, it's an example of the city trying to use every tool in the toolkit. It's right on the main drag in the core of our Southside downtown. It was in deplorable condition for many, many years. The city chose to take on this property with a conservatorship. We actually went to court. We were able to take control of the building. We found some funding where we could stabilize the building with a new roof and other work just to keep it stable, to keep it from crumbling. It was the kind of building we really needed to save because it's in the core of the historic district. We've been able to guide this then. It has a new owner, and we're working with the new owner to get some additional funding for cleanup on the interior, et cetera. But this is a building where the city really invested a lot of time and resources through the conservatorship to do what we needed to do. It's not a home run kind of a project, but not every project really is a home run. Sometimes we need to really concentrate on some of the smaller, more infill buildings, because that's really what most of our projects are. So I think that is my last slide. I'll turn it over to Steve for his review of what's going on in Easton.
Okay, well, as Darlene had said, my architectural firm is in Easton, although I live in Bethlehem for most of my life, so I'm very familiar with the things that Darlene is speaking of. I'm also somewhat familiar with Lancaster, but not from a development standpoint. We have friends there and we go there often. My firm was started in 2000, although I've been practicing for about, 35 years. And for the most part, it's been urban, it's been historic preservation based, it's has a sustainability focus, and it's mostly involved in urban development. I like to believe that, as Darlene had said, it's not the home runs. There's a lot of background to a city that makes the bones of the city, and I've touched a lot of those. I don't have I mean, I've won a few AIA design awards for some of my projects, some of which were urban and some of which were infill as well. But there's a lot to be said for what constitutes a city and the historic districts. With that in mind, just to run through, as it was said originally, I am the vice chair of the Lehigh Valley Planning Commission. That's sort of like the global view of the region. Everything that happens in the region comes through the Planning Commission, and it gives you a good bird's eye view of what's happening not only in the cities and how to direct projects that are outside the cities that could either contribute or diminish growth of the region. I am also, or formerly, I was on the Lehigh Valley Land Trust, which much of what I have done was taken buildings that were eyesores, abandoned, or unwanted, and turn them around. Mixed use and rehab is the key to my firm, and a lot of the work I do is reflective of that, and we'll go through that shortly. I was also on, or I'm also alternate on the Easton Historic District Commission, where if an architect has a conflict of interest, I step in and serve in that mode as well. I was also on the steering committee that developed the Southside Historic District guidelines that are now being used. I'm sure they've changed over the years because that was almost 20 years ago, but that is something that architects need to participate in. And the things that I participate in are just almost adjunct of what I do every day. So they're not taking a large leap, they're just contributing where there needs to be a bit of expertise that you can offer to back to the community. I also serve on 2 building code boards of appeal, because in many instances, older buildings do not, just like planning and zoning, old things don't fit the new regs. And there's appeal boards for zoning, there's special exceptions for planning. In building codes, sometimes you just can't occupy a building that existed for 100 years and the regs just don't accommodate it. So there needs to be some place for those appeals to occur. I'm sitting on the City of Easton, the Borough of Glendon, and originally when I worked in Reading, I was also one of the original people on the Reading Building Code Board of Appeals. And in my spare time, I was on the South Bethlehem Historical Society and the Bethlehem Fine Arts Commission and the Historic Easton, which was a major preservation organization in the 80s in the city of Easton. A couple of the works I have, this is in addition to the commercial, actually the Bar Association in the city of Easton that just needed to expand. Some of these are projects where people reached but didn't necessarily complete. So you go to the next slide. This in the 80s, this was a this was a vacant building, as there were like 30 vacant buildings in Easton, and they were in the historic district. So the city brought together grant funds, historic tax credits, which were not from the city, but from the National Park Service, and renovated about 30 buildings in Easton. This is just one of the more charming ones, and turned it into apartments with the necessary incentives to take empty buildings, literally give them to developers, of which I was the architect and developer with a group of other architects to redo these buildings. Continue. Next slide. This was a project. A developer came to me and said, we'd like to turn this into an office building. During the process, and bear in mind what it looks like now, go to the next slide. We took this building and restored it. We ended up renting the second floor as our office. But just to see the transformation that you can do with a building that people would generally say, it's so awful, I don't, tear it down. There there is a lot to be said for working with the materials you have, not only from a preservation standpoint, but also from a sustainability standpoint of simply not taking the time and effort to reduce something to rubble and replacing it with something new and bright and shiny just because that's what everyone wants to see. This to me is bright and shiny. This is transformative. Next. This was a set of buildings that was slated for demolition, and on the when I was in historic Easton, we took this to Washington to basically stop the demolition, and we had a consultation with the National Park Service to retain 2 of the 4 buildings that they wanted to demolish. My office at the time was also on the 2nd floor of this building. Not at the time, the building was falling down and collapsing, and of course they couldn't be saved. And there they are. They're now an ongoing restaurant and office complex next to the very impressive post office in downtown Easton. Next. This was just one of the earlier renovations I was involved in. This one faces due east towards New Jersey in Easton. Continue. This is actually a somewhat significant building. There's a famous, sort of predating Jimmy Hoffa, this was Judge Crater's home, which is a judge that disappeared, who knows? And we redid this into apartments. It was, again, a vacant building. And this, when I was in Reading, there were a lot of mill buildings in Reading, and there's a couple you'll see coming up. This is before. This is what the cards were dealt with. What do you do with this? We turned it into apartments. Next, please. So now this building is not only contributing to the economic viability of Reading, but it's also a great building, a great restoration. Again, historic tax credits were involved in making this project viable. Next. This was an old school in York. Next. And again, it was converted into apartments and is now what was empty and derelict is now, you know, a building where people live and work from. Next. This is, again, an old school in Easton. The Easton School District pretty much left it neglected. I was requested to do a feasibility study, which you'll see some renderings next. And basically, we turned this, we just sort of opened people's eyes to see what could be done with it. It was purchased by a developer and is now, again, apartments transformed from school. These are great spaces. You couldn't build a space with 14-foot ceilings. And now they're apartments and people are living and, you know, working from there. Next. This was a gorgeous mansion in Reading, and the owner put it on the, if it wasn't on the National Register, I believe he placed it on the National Register as it was an industrialist house, converted it to a bed and breakfast where it's now just an amazing place to stage events. Next. And this is another project in York. This was the old Osteopathic Hospital, right adjacent to the fairgrounds. Empty building, falling down. The county approached the developer that I've worked with and said, what can we do? Our options are figure out something or we're tearing it down. This particular one had PHFA financing. For the time, it was turned into 3 buildings. Next slide. Of energy efficient apartments. Every apartment has its own heat pump. Windows were replaced, insulated, double glazed, and next. And interesting, the incentive, because the developer had to own this building for 25 years, they didn't want utility bills to increase. So they basically proposed not an electric resistance system, but a heat pump system for the entire facility. And that's, I think that's the extent of my slides. Is that correct? Oh, right. And then there's opportunities where you have buildings that are too far gone and not really contributing, but there's in a historic district. This is a project proposed for the just outside the downtown district that I worked on for literally 10 years. Probably many of those were just accumulating the 6 or 7 or 8 lots that were required to pull this together because each lot individually was suitable for maybe a townhouse. and we're putting 37 apartments, potential grocery store, and parking on multiple levels, sort of tying the west ward of Easton, which is a food desert, into the downtown with this huge gap in the streetscape. And this is on the main street, Northampton Street of Easton. I think there's another slide of this. This is actually a context rendering of the building. And the next slide just sort of shows the streetscape from 6th to 7th, which basically is the longest block in Easton. And you can see the key location that is. To the far left is the top of the hill at 6th Street in Easton, which is where the downtown slopes to the Delaware River. And I think that's it. You're on, Jeremy.
Thank you, Stephen, and good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here with all of you, and many thanks to AIIPA for having me this morning. I'm Jeremy Young, Director of Community and Economic Development at Lancaster City Alliance. Next slide. We are next slide, a private 501c3 nonprofit organization focused on community and economic development, improving quality of life and public safety in the city of Lancaster, and generally an organization that promotes city growth and stability so that Lancaster City flourishes and everyone shares in its success. Next slide. Just a quick snapshot of the city of Lancaster. Founded in 1729, we're a dense older city, historically laid out over 4 square miles. Our community has strong foundations in great architecture spanning from the colonial period to the 21st century, and our largely preserved historic building stock has served as the backdrop of our ongoing revitalization. Many old tobacco warehouses and industrial buildings have been adaptively reused for housing, office, and hotels over the last 15, 20 years. We're the largest National Register of Historic Places historic district in the United States with over 14,000 contributing structures. But at the same time, as you'll see, we're beginning to welcome new and more contemporary architecture styles. We're the seat of Lancaster County. We've got 60,000 residents, 40,000 employees, 8,000 college students, and pre-COVID, over 1 million visitors per year. Next slide, please. Some highlights about our downtown. Next slide, please. We've got a very strong indie retail scene with over 160 places to shop. Next slide. Very diverse and nationally acclaimed culinary scene with over 100 food and beverage establishments in the downtown. Next slide. We've got over 90 art venues, galleries, performing arts spaces, and unique entertainment attractions. Next slide, please. Most of this, or much of this, was shepherded by more than $1.5 billion of private and publicly subsidized investment over the period of roughly 2005 to 2015. And this was really led by strong collaboration between the private and public sectors, which is something we're really fortunate and blessed here in Lancaster to have, that strong partnership mentality. Next slide, please. Now, after that period of 2005 to 2015, we've had our eye on the future, looking toward 2030 and beyond. Lancaster City Alliance, my organization, developed and manages the implementation of the city's 15-year economic development strategic plan. That was adopted in 2015 and remains one of our largest bodies of work. The plan has some very bold aspirations, which you see here. Next slide, please. And the plan's laid out in 4 broad strategies. I'll cover some highlights for you this morning related to Strategy 1, focused on traditional economic development investment, and Strategy 4, next slide, focused on strengthening our neighborhood spines, which we call commercial hubs. Next, please. Those commercial hubs you see here, the key premise of the Building on Strength plan is that we'd like to see continued investment and growth in the downtown core like we saw in the decade before the plan, hence the name Building on Strength. But importantly, also in areas of the city which haven't seen investment in a very long time. And you can see these are key corridors, again, spines of our neighborhoods in the city. Next slide, please. By 2030, the community would like to see key bricks and sticks goals realized, as well as an increase in city incomes. And that's really the whole purpose of economic development. And you can see those goals there. Next slide, please. But as a third-class city, unfortunately, we're really hamstrung and have limited options for generating new revenues to address key challenges in our community, and to support economic development. But we're very fortunate to be one of the key, to have a key tool in our economic development toolbox, and that is the City Revitalization and Improvement Zone program, governed by a local CRIZ authority. We're only one of a handful of municipalities in Pennsylvania that have access to this tool. I believe my colleague in Bethlehem also has access to this tool as well. Next slide, please. The CRIZ program, which brought around $8.7 million in state and local tax revenues generated in the CRIZ districts back to the community in 2020 from 2019 to support economic development in the zone. Next slide, please. Providing key funding support to large-scale projects like the Marriott Hotel East Tower expansion at Penn Square. Next slide. And the 101 North Queen Street mixed-use redevelopment, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Next slide. These are large-scale projects, but the CRIZ program has also supported smaller-scale neighborhood-oriented developments like Plaza Centro in the southeast neighborhood of our city. Next slide, please. Our Facade Improvement Grant Program is another key tool we have in our toolbox here in Lancaster City, and this is funded 95% by private philanthropy. Very fortunate to have this private support. In the last 4 years, we've been able to raise more than $650,000 in funding to provide grants to property owners to support more than $1 million in new neighborhood investment. Next slide, please. In the last 3 years, and you can see our funders there. Next slide, please. In the last 3 years, we've been able to support more than 100 facade improvement projects, and you can see where those projects currently stand, completed, actively under construction, and in the queue to start soon. If you could scroll through a few of those examples there, please, Michelle. We've enjoyed a lot of success with this program and preparing to run out of funding soon and already looking toward identifying additional funding sources. But you can see these projects have been really catalytic for our neighborhoods, revitalizing key anchor buildings. Sorry, Michelle, if you could go back just a little bit there, maybe 2 or 3 slides. A key structure in our downtown, if you'll go back one more, Michelle, please. The former Hess's department store, which was developed during the urban renewal period in the 1960s, early 1970s. Unfortunately, it was a failed endeavor, along with the full city block that was demolished to support this large-scale urban renewal development. You can see, again, through strong collaboration in the community and a good deal of risk from a private developer. Next slide, you can see what this building has been transformed into. Again, an example of a contemporary structure breathing new life into our historic community, really bringing back life to a big dead zone, essentially, in our downtown. Next slide, please. Of course, that facility opened right in the heart of COVID, by the way, so they're still working to lease some of that retail space. But we're hopeful that once we're out of COVID, that those spaces will fill up quickly. The Yule Plaza, as it's now known, formerly Lancaster Square, part of that failed urban renewal retail plaza center, currently in the process of being reinvigorated, and a new public parking garage and new home for the Lancaster Public Library actively under construction. You can see what that plaza will look like soon. Next slide, please. Just running you through some examples of some of the development that we currently have in the pipeline. This is the first privately funded, I should say, largest privately funded apartment building in Lancaster City in more than 50 years, over 100 units at Stadium Row, adjacent to Clipper Magazine Stadium, market rate units. Next slide, please. The historic Southern Market, one of 5 original market houses in the city, 4 of which still remain today, but only 1 is in use as a public produce market. The Southern Market is currently being reinvigorated through the support of Willow Valley Communities, who's developing across the street. This will become a 21st century food hall and co-working space. Next slide. And that's opening, by the way, at the end of this year. Willow Valley Communities, as I mentioned, developing across Vine Street at the intersection of Queen and Vine. This is a block south of Penn Square. developing this modern structure, a 150-unit senior living tower, which will become the largest building in Lancaster County. And this project, along with the Southern Market Center, as well as a project by Lancaster History, formerly known as the Lancaster County Historical Society, to renovate the historic Thaddeus Stevens abolitionist congressman home into a museum, which will really put Lancaster on the Underground Railroad map. This is really going to reinvigorate this key intersection and gateway into our downtown. Next slide, please. Got some other projects on the fringe of downtown. This is another senior living facility, Landis Place on King, and the 200 block of West King Street, really seen as the last frontier for revitalization in our downtown. That will offer ground floor retail and restaurant space as well. Next slide. North of downtown, a partnership between Penn Medicine, Lancaster General Health, and the Hankin Group, a Chester County developer, developing this significant mixed-use redevelopment with more than 250 new market rate apartments, ground floor retail and restaurant space, as well as medical offices for Penn Medicine, Lancaster General Health, and a new urgent care. Next slide. We're also seeing new affordable housing, which is really filling a critical need in our community, as I'm sure that's a critical need in many of your communities throughout the state as well. Really nationwide, this is an issue. SACA Development Corporation, Spanish American Civic Association, has developed 9 townhomes as part of what will eventually be 18 new townhomes for sale at an affordable purchase price. The ribbon cutting for this project was just last week. So very exciting to welcome these new homes to our southeast neighborhood. Next slide, please. And fortunately, the image is not showing there, but the St. Joseph's Hospital campus, as you can see here, a full-scale redevelopment of that campus is underway, currently in the planning stages, but will represent more than a $90 million investment by a private developer out of Baltimore in partnership with our local HTC Mid-Atlantic. So there will be more than 120 affordable apartments as part of this redevelopment, as well as 170 market rate apartments and townhomes, as well as a substantial amount of new ground floor neighborhood retail and restaurant space on College Avenue. Next slide. Finally, the Stockyards, which was a key area north of the city near the Lancaster train station, which is one of our building on strength plan commercial hubs that's focused on for new growth. This project was just announced in the last couple weeks with more than 200 new market rate, but also some affordable units as well, hopefully. And this is just one of several projects that we're aware of that are currently in the pipeline in this train station area. Currently in the process of beginning a new planning process to re-envision this key gateway into the city from the north around the Lancaster train station, funded by PennDOT, $100,000 planning initiative. This area spans the border between Lancaster City and Manheim Township to the north, and really a goal with that planning process to create a place instead of some fragmented planning. But it's worth noting that the Lancaster train station is the state's 3rd busiest train station in Pennsylvania. Next slide. As far as our 2030 outcomes go for the Building on Strength plan, you saw these already. We're actually making remarkable progress. Next slide, please. You can see just 6 years into the implementation of the plan, we've already far exceeded some of our goals, particularly on new retail and restaurant space, where we wanted to see 100,000 square feet of new space by 2030. We've actually been exceeding that goal for more than 2 years. Also exceeding the goals on new office space and on the privately led investment goal of $1 billion, with more than 1.23 billion of new development either completed, actively under construction, or in the pipeline as of the end of September. We're in the process now of beginning to think about how we tweak some of these goals, recognizing how we've already met them so early in the planned timeline. And there's a key opportunity now to do that as the city's comprehensive plan process is currently underway. The city currently working to update its comprehensive plan as the last plan was adopted in 1993. So long overdue, and hoping that we can dovetail with that planning process to refresh some of our goals as we continue to look out to 2030. Next slide, please. Again, these are the planned focus areas where we'd like to see that new growth and investment in the city of Lancaster. If you turn to the next slide, Michelle, you'll see where that new investment, that $1.23 billion of investment is occurring. As you might expect, as we saw a lot of investment in the downtown in the 10, 15 years prior to the Building on Strength plan, we're still seeing a lot of new investment in the downtown. But what's really key and tied to that key premise of the plan is that we're really starting to see that new investment and growth trickling out of downtown into those key corridors or hubs, as we call them, in the city. And for the first time, we added the train station area to this bar chart or dashboard. That Stockyards project that I showed you represents just $48 million of that $1.23 billion. Next slide, please. I think that's all I have. Just again, some quick highlights of some of the development activity. Don't be fooled. I've showed you some of our successes. Lancaster, like many cities in our state, especially a third-class city, has continues to struggle with key challenges, including poverty is one of our biggest challenges, and the housing affordability, just two key issues that we continue to wrestle with. But we're hoping that again, through continued collaboration and partnership, that we can really address those issues in earnest. There's my contact info. If anybody would like to learn more about Lancaster, feel free to reach out, and happy to have a conversation. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you, Jeremy. That was great. I think both of you showed us that the types of projects that you guys focus on within your community vary greatly in terms of scale. I mean, there's enormously large plum projects, and then what I call the berries. There's 10 of those may not even come close to equaling the large projects, yet they distribute themselves throughout the community and tie things together in ways that a large project might be a draw. You still have to get there, and you have to walk. You do your facade grants, you do your various other types of smaller program streetscapes. So my first two questions, I'll just wrap them up, are who do you feel are the key players in the community's revitalization and growth? Obviously, you both sit on the receiving end of what direction the community is going, and there are the players that participate, and I'm wondering who should participate. And this is more to let other communities understand the requirements of getting development fulfilled that meets the needs of the community. Feel free to lead into that, Darlene.
Sure. I think one of our responsibilities as the planning bureau for the city is really to let, through our policies and our ordinances and our goals and objectives, to let the property owners and developers know what it is that we expect for redevelopment and infill projects. What kind of development do we want to see? And we want to be clear about that, so that as people move ahead with projects, there's some equal understanding about the kind of projects that can really be supported in our downtown areas and our commercial areas. We're fortunate to have some significant anchors. Lehigh University is a significant partner with us. Sometimes because they're coming down off the mountain, they're expanding the Packer the Packer campus into the downtown. So as they create new office space, administrative offices or things like that, they're coordinating that with office development in the downtown. They don't need to create it on their own campus always. And the new dormitories are being built closer to the downtown and things like that. And they're very good partners, not just in that kind of development, but one of the key projects on the south side is the redevelopment of the New Street corridor. And we're revamping that with some considerable investment, and they're participating in a significant way in that as well. And then we also have some nonprofits. An Arts Quest for Bethlehem would be a huge one, arts and cultural nonprofit group. They lead many of our festivals. For Music Fest, they bring in over 1 million people to our city in 10 days. But they also are a great partner with redevelopment of property and their expansions, and what do we want the city to look like, and how can we interact? So I think we need to reach out to our nonprofit groups, and also the universities. Moravian College up on the north side, also investing in the north side. Reaching out to partners is always very key, and we need to nurture those partnerships. Even when there's not a project going on per se right now, our planning needs to reflect the needs of our partners as well.
Yeah. In Germany, do you have the kind of, I know in Bethlehem, the institutions aren't not necessarily hospitals, they're basically around the town, but you have, you have your colleges as well, Franklin and Marshall, and potential hospitals that tend to want to gobble up whatever's around them, and you want to work with that in a most positive way to affect your community.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'd like to point out, in the 1990s, when our downtown was really cratering, if you will, many large anchor businesses and companies were leaving the city, leaving downtown. There was a pivotal decision made by many of our key employers in the downtown to stay and really re-anchor themselves. And really without that decision, I think our city might have failed. And quite to the contrary, the private sector, the large employers, for example, Fulton Bank, the Lancaster newspapers, the Diamond Communications, the hospital, Lancaster General Hospital, Penn Medicine, they've continued to lead, both, leading the dialogue in our community, but also they remain key funders and founders of our organization, which is leading growth through the Building on Strength plan, which I talked about. And yes, we are very fortunate to have another key player and supporter is Franklin and Marshall College, but we also have Millersville University in our downtown as well as Pennsylvania College of Art and Design, Thaddeus Stevens College. So they're very fortunate. Really, we're able to harvest the power of the private sector to shape the city's growth, and the private sector plays a powerful role and has a strong voice in guiding the future.
Yeah, and I think from my standpoint, I was involved very early on in basically rewriting the Easton zoning ordinance as a guide to exactly that, a guide to developers, let them understand what you are looking for. We worked with our state rep, Robert Freeman, who sponsored a bill at the House to allow for form-based design codes to be implemented in Pennsylvania. And I believe we were the first community with his assistance to implement such a zoning ordinance. It was just unheard of that you could have graphics in a zoning ordinance, which is exactly what it defines as how the form of the city should look. So that was a community committee, starting initially with just a group of people, ending up with a city-appointed committee of over 20 people to get a zoning ordinance together. I think that group ended up having a lot better understanding of the implications of zoning, which are usually implemented almost in a vacuum without much citizens' participation, because it is a highly technical document, yet it's incredibly impactful on a community and how, where things grow, how you can engage the people who are involved in doing development, like institutions, especially because they are a key person in terms of investment in the community. The next item is regarding the local institution. How do you feel they've affected your city, and what in many cases they're nonprofits like hospitals and institution, and they aren't taxed in the normal way as a lot of people are. Do you have arrangements for payment in lieu of taxes for services? How does that work for both of your communities, since you both, and I know Easton does in particular, have a large proportion of their land, which is fairly small in Easton's instance, is owned by nonprofit universities, and I know Bethlehem has universities, and you have hospitals and universities in your town as well. Can you speak to those points in terms of tax incentives and also services and the taxes that they technically don't have to pay?
Mm-hmm. We do not have a pilot program with Lehigh University. It was discussed, I guess, maybe 8 or 10 years ago.
If I could interrupt, just because it was a pilot is payment in lieu of taxes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, that's right. But thank you for clarifying. We really work with Lehigh more specifically to talk about what are our common goals and objectives for the community. Lehigh did a campus master plan, I believe it was back around the year 2000, and they had new leadership at the time. And prior to that, they were moving sort of up the mountain, away from the downtown. And the leadership at the time knew that what they needed to do was really integrate with the downtown, and the master plan reflected that. And since that time, they have begun to do that. They've built into the core of the city, and we've been able to sort of mesh our downtown with their campus so that they are much more integrated. And we like that. So we're able to work with them on projects that are really win-win for both. I mentioned we have Southside Ambassadors that really tend to the streetscape on the south side, and also they actually are ambassadors for tourists and visitors. That program is funded by Lehigh. They invest in some bricks and mortar ways, but also in some programmatic ways. And they've invested in our code enforcement program. They have invested in staff here in our code office so that we can really attack code enforcement in a more organized, proactive way in South Bethlehem. So we've really found it more effective to sit down and talk with them about what do we need for our resources and how can they help us with that. That's been more helpful to us than I think looking for the payment in lieu of taxes.
Okay, Jeremy?
Yeah, no, we're very fortunate to have both many nonprofit entities, large nonprofit entities, providing pilots, including Lancaster General Hospital, I believe, but many others, especially large employers in the downtown and property owners in the downtown. We also have had, like Bethlehem, ambassadors patrolling streets in various neighborhoods throughout the city, actually dating back to 2003, when our organization, pre-merger with the Lancaster Alliance, the James Street Improvement District, which was actually created by Lancaster General Hospital and Franklin Marshall College, an effort to strengthen the neighborhoods between the two institutions. Those two entities, again, I think I mentioned earlier, remain two of our largest funders as an organization, and much of their dollars go toward funding those clean and safe services that the ambassadors provide. I think it is a real struggle, though. I mean, regarding pilots, I mean, I think over a third of our properties in the city are owned by tax-exempt entities. And so what do you do, especially recognizing, the ever-escalating costs of police and fire protection, for example, which really eat up a majority of our budget.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, that's a difficult problem for smaller cities because the institutions do tend to grow. I mean, they're as invested in the city as the city is invested in itself. They're not going anywhere. They, like you say, they own a third of the property. They're not going to pick up and move. They're not an industry that can just relocate. So, you're sort of stuck needing to constantly communicate and understand each other's goals so they can in fact mesh, and nobody can get everything out of these things. Next question would be, are there projects that, this is sort of a give or take. We've talked about institutionals. What about developers? Developers come in, they have a goal. They're there to make money and potentially contribute to the community in a way that probably benefits them the most. Obviously, the city has its own goals as what benefits the city. And in some cases, with the politics as things are, there's some overlap and there's some meshing of that. So how do you sort of work with developers? Obviously, there's zoning, there's variances, there's planning, there's ways to manipulate the system to each other's betterment. What is your feeling about how that works equitably?
I'll start if you want.
Sure.
Sure. And like I said, one thing that I think we have a responsibility to do is to be clear in our guidelines and goals and objectives. This is the kind of development that we want to see, so that we're not surprising anybody. Property owners know, developers know as they come into our community. One issue that we have had on the south side. We have design guidelines for the historic district. We have design guidelines in the zoning ordinance. And it is a historic district. It's a local ordinance district. We have a review board. But at the same time, in our zoning ordinance, we're very liberal in height. And we have had several projects really where developers have proposed to demolish buildings and then build up, increase the massing on the site, because our zoning ordinance allows that. So we did take a look this summer, this past year, to try to mesh the goals and objectives of the two ordinances, the historic district and the zoning ordinance. And it's very challenging to come to some consensus within the community about how liberal should we be and how restrictive should we be, and what's the massing that's appropriate for the south side. So we're really working through that. So sometimes that's been a challenge for us as new development comes in. We see new property owners, new projects, and we've had to navigate that on a case-by-case basis. So that has been a challenge for us, but we do try to be clear from the beginning, I think, in our plans and like I said, our goals and objectives. So that's been a challenge for us. I think that, as Jeremy noted, we are also a CRIS. I think when we have incentives that we can provide, that does give us more leverage to talk about revisions to a plan or tweaking maybe the uses that are provided or things like that mesh with the downtown in a healthier way. We also on the Steel Stacks site, we did have a tax increment financing program there that expired. That was a 20-year program that expired, and we're looking at providing LERTA there. We have other financing programs, but when we are able to provide incentive, it's true, we have a little bit more leverage, and we can talk a little bit more about what's healthier for the community.
Can I jump in for a second? Some of the other sort of newer advisory boards, like the environmental advisory boards that I know Bethlehem and Easton have, I don't know if Lancaster has one. My feeling is that's going to be coming more into play in the future as development comes in and as energy issues and environmental issues impact the city more and more with global warming. I think their voice is small now, and that, as well as I know in South Bethlehem, it's a conservation district, I guess, as it is on the north side. It's advisory to city council, ends up determining what the final outcome are. But each of those contribute to the overall result of the development. It's just interesting to see how those are accounted for now and in the future. Sorry, Jeremy, you're on.
Well, I'll just jump on that if you don't mind for a second. We do have an active EAC. They review all of our plans, and they are a recommending body. They only provide recommendations. That's the extent of their authority. But we also adopted a climate action plan for the city this past year, and we're really trying to build on that. We need to incorporate those goals and objectives into our ordinances, and the EAC is helping us with that. We also use LANTA, which is our local transit authority. They review all of our plans, and we really want to incorporate the infrastructure necessary for transit improvements. And so we're trying to have a larger picture as we try to be inclusive in our reviews of these projects.
Jeremy?
we also have in Lancaster a body that plays an advisory role and provides a recommendation to City Council on development. That's the Historical Commission, and I would say historic preservation and new development is a balance in our community, and it's often the source of a friction point. And really, the Historical Commission has really shaped our development, and I think it's been a great tool for our community in ensuring that we preserve, our historic built environment, but at the same time make room for new structures. So that's one hot button issue in our community. And I mentioned the affordable housing issue in our community. It seems that just about every new project that comes before the approving bodies, there's a call from the public to require those developers to incorporate affordable units, but we really have no mechanism by which to do that. And so I mentioned that the city is in the process now of updating its comprehensive plan, and I'm hopeful that that process will resolve some key issues about how can we, address the affordability of housing through zoning potentially, but also, can we determine, when it's appropriate to sacrifice some of our historic built environment for newer, more dense development, for example. I think this is a key conversation that we're going to have as a community over the next couple of years.
Sure, and also wield more energy efficient development too, which, the building codes are a minimum bar. People don't understand that. Yes, it's minimally safe and it's minimally energy efficient, and it does incrementally improve in theory every 3 years, or in Pennsylvania's instance, every 6 years. So it's lagging there. And that's going to be critical for the overall viability of cities in the long run. We'll take one more question, and then we'll go to the audience questions. How much do you feel that the urban design, architecture, and planning brought to these projects by developers or the city? How relevant do you feel the quality of that versus the sort of the need to infill the voids you have in the city? Do you feel that sort of more generic architecture, as I've seen in some instances from the slides, is perfectly appropriate, or is one outstanding building of high quality essential to your goals?
Well, we had design guidelines in our zoning ordinance, and we also have local ordinance historic districts. I think we understand that good design is important for infill projects. And we've really tried to pay more attention, I guess, to the redevelopment that's occurring in the core of the city. There's certainly redevelopment occurring in the outlying areas as well, and we're much more flexible there. But we try to be quite sensitive, really, to good design. And I think that although our Historic Conservation Commission has struggled with many of these larger projects, because we have had some that are very significantly large. I think that the fact that they have an opportunity for input has been really very important. It makes the community think about good design, and also there's some interaction with property owners about things that they might not have thought of. One thing that we're really trying to be sensitive to is the first floor, the storefronts. We require in zoning that the first floor includes retail, personal service, restaurant uses. We're more flexible on the upper floors, but also architecturally, from a design perspective, we want to know how those buildings are going to interact with the street. That's important for us. And honestly, there have been projects where we've learned some things in the past about what we would want to do differently. So sometimes on the upper floors, I think we can be more flexible in design and things like that. But how is the public going to be interacting with these projects from the street level? That's important to us.
Right. And I believe even in Easton's zoning ordinance, they have a percentage of glazing requirement for the first floor for exactly that reason. So there aren't just small, small perforated openings. Jeremy?
Yeah, it sounds like Bethlehem and Lancaster have a lot of parallels in that regard. Lancaster's really, I mentioned it's a very dense city, and therefore it's very walkable. It's just 2 miles across from one side to the other. Our development process and our ordinances really, I think, have ensured that new development respects the street. And I think there are quite a number of examples, including some that I showed on my slides earlier this morning, of developments that were required to have a certain setback off the street, especially if they were taller.
Okay, thank you. Michelle, you have questions from the audience or participants or whatever they're called?
Yep, we do. And I'm actually going to let Amal pose the first one. She's got one from Senator Argyle, so kicking me over to Amal.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was wonderful, and I'm getting a lot of questions. So I want to acknowledge Senator Dave Argyle. He has been a champion of historic preservation, downtown development, everything that we've discussed on here. So thank you, Senator, for being on. Sorry that I am not able to unmute you, but the Senator does have 2 questions. One, he recently attended a meeting regarding the Tamaqua Criz. Some businesses are complaining about building codes and that they hurt the revitalization of older buildings. Even I think that you were talking about this when you were talking about Board of Appeals. But another complaint is that if we don't have good codes, it allows blight to continue. So how can we reconcile this if we want to help breathe life into into older buildings as we continue our revitalization efforts?
Well, obviously the primary point of building codes is safety, but there are alternatives, and you could be very creative. For instance, I'm staring at a 6-story wood frame building across the street from my office, and there is no way that you could open up the building code and say, let's put this in there. Yet through appeals and through avenues within the code, the existing building code has plenty of ways that don't even require an appeal to make a building that you simply could not build today perfectly acceptable and safe as an occupied building. In terms of property maintenance, that's a completely other facet of it. If your building is not kept up and maintained, there certainly needs to be some regulations to make sure that it can be. Darlene spoke of the building on the south side that was taken over by the city because it was literally owned by somebody who refused to, you literally had a clawed from his dying hands before he would do anything. And in that instance, it was. So there are mechanisms where sometimes people aren't responsible just because they own buildings. And they may be in a key location and they just may say, I'll take the next offer, and they get an offer and they say, well, it's obviously worth more than that. So it just sits there for decades. And there needs to be a mechanism for that as well. And those people will complain about, how dare you take my building, yet they are not contributing. My feeling is the land should be taxed as well as the building, so that if there's no building on the land, they just have no justification for keeping it because it's too expensive. That's another avenue to make a building, how should we say, more mobile. I hope that answers both questions, but feel free to join in.
If I may, and by the way, thank you, Senator Argyle, for your recent support of changes to the state historic tax credit program. I know you were a champion there. We've got a very vibrant downtown, but at the same time, we still have many buildings, in our first few blocks that have completely vacant upper floors. And that's an example of perhaps where changes or exceptions to certain building codes could accommodate, reinvigorating some of those spaces to produce more residential in our downtown, more office space, et cetera. But at the same time, while those codes present many challenges, they're really needed. So really, it's quite a conundrum. What do you do?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the building code by any means. I can talk to you about the municipalities planning code, but not the building code. But I would say I would agree with Jeremy that the issue that I hear the most frequently is about how can we reuse these upper floors? That's the challenge. And as Steve noted, the code is there for safety reasons, and it's a minimum code, so we have to be cognizant of that as well. So there are challenges, especially for our buildings that have the larger footprint. So
Right.
Yeah, one of the recommendations in our building on strength plan is upper floor redevelopment. That's one of the recommendations that we haven't made any traction on yet. And it would really be great to see some sort of support from the legislature and the governor on some sort of subsidy that could help us to reinvigorate some of those spaces.
Right. I've been working on a number of those projects, some of which, certainly if you put residential in, the code requires sprinklers. However, not in all cases. There are ways to work around that within the code, and there are also variances and alternatives. From my position as Code Board of Appeals, I've seen things that, you're right, don't make sense and really don't necessarily make the building any less safe than what's already in there. And those things can be considered at the appeals level. So on the other hand, I'm doing a 3-unit addition to a 200-foot by 30-foot long building. Those 3 units require a sprinkler, and there's no way around that. Yet here I have a developer who's putting in sprinklers. So as needed, it doesn't have to be a complete redo. It could just be an isolated portion of the building when it's new. So there's, with the right skill, there are ways to work around, not work around, but work with the work with the code.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. And I think that you highlighted the existing building code, which I think a lot of people don't know exists within the suite of codes. And I think that if I could give a plug, that's why it's so important to work with an architect that is a code professional. One last one, and then I know Michelle has some other questions. Tamaqua has seen some CRIS success, but it's been slower than they hope. Are Bethlehem and Lancaster satisfied with the growth of their CRIS zones, or is it slower than they had originally hoped when the program began in 2014?
Happy to kick that off, Darlene, if you'd like.
Okay.
So
okay.
It's funny, I mentioned our last return of state and local revenue from the state and the city last year was $8.7 million. The very first year that we received increment back in 2014, I believe, we only received $2,500. So clearly something was wrong, and we were able to work through it with our partners at the state, in the legislature and at the executive branch level. But I understand it's not working, uniformly across all 4 of the CRIS programs in the state.
Yeah, and that's not something that I am specifically responsible for, but I know that the city has gone back and worked with Harrisburg on tweaking some things to assist with some of the projects in Bethlehem as well. And as we got more familiar with the CRIS opportunity and we're able to work with property owners, we were able to see more success in some later years. So it was an adjustment for us. We're certainly happy to have it, and it's a great tool for us to have. But I think in the first couple of years, yes, there were some growing pains there, I would say.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Senator, for those questions. Stephen, did you have something to add?
No, I was just going to pass it off to Michelle.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amal. Thanks, Senator. Okay, so we do have some great questions that have come in throughout the presentation. I'm going to pose them in the order that they came in. The first one is for Darlene. Please go into more detail about the success of businesses incubated at the factory.
Oh, that's sure. That they and that's actually privately initiated and funded and operated. Like I said, the founder of Pet Fresh, or Fresh Pet rather, sold the business and wanted to be able to, in an entrepreneurial way, assist businesses that had about $20 million or $2 million of gross income, and he's built an incubator space. He's brought people in from out of the region. I think I made a little note of some of those Mikey's and I forget what some of the other incubators are. Mikey's, Stuffed Puffs, Pipcorn, if you've heard of that, Honey Stingers. He takes some of these small businesses and nurtures them. He helps them with a variety of things, marketing and outreach and they run surveys, etc. They bring the public in to test the food. He's also collaborated to start up smaller businesses. He'll run some competitions and things, and there's actually some prize money for some of the smaller businesses that he's helping throughout the valley to really kickstart themselves. But that is a program, in all honesty, it has no public funding in it. He was able to initiate that and is investing a lot in order to nurture these businesses. And then, of course, he has some stake in those businesses as they grow, but it's right downtown. It's reuse of an old Bethlehem steel building, and we're happy to have him.
Thanks, Darlene. Next question. Does the Lehigh Valley Planning Commission control entitlements for multiple municipalities, or is it in addition to the Planning Commission's entitlement bodies within each municipality?
The Lehigh Valley Planning Commission is strictly advisory, as are all state planning commissions, and this is having, in particular in Lehigh Valley, almost puts us in a very bad position, because if we see bad development and it benefits a local municipality, they end up with their zoning ordinance have the final say. So we give them very professional and very specific advice on what we would recommend, but it's not a board that can require anyone to do anything. Now, the Lehigh Valley Planning Commission is also the municipal planning organization, which, how should we say, distributes financing for infrastructure, for road work and so on. But in terms of directing development, other than a nice little, we hate to say we told you so, that's about all we can do. And we would really like to see that change so that we had more impact on development trends in the region.
Thank you. All right, next question. Are there any intentional considerations for lifespan of new contemporary construction? So many old and historic urban structures have lifespans of over 100 years, and a lot of modern construction deteriorates physically and visually much quicker. Are there considerations for overall longevity of these mixed historic and new neighborhoods?
Interesting question.
That's a tough one.
I can't speak on building code requirements per se, because my background really is planning. I think, though, from our perspective, we try to look at sustainable development as uses that are compatible and can be mixed use projects. The more varied the uses are in our community, the better the lifespan, I think, for much of these buildings, and the greater their opportunity for reuse in the future if that becomes necessary. So sustainable in that way, I think we try to look at them from a use perspective. Again, we also work with our EAC for projects that are environmentally sensitive. But as far as building code issues, I really, maybe you could take that, Steve.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a matter of cost. If someone chooses to, like for instance, a university or a hospital, they'll build a 100-year building because they know it's up to them to maintain that, so it continues to reduce cost long term. A developer may come in and do a thin brick building, for instance, which I would consider a minimal, material that gives it the impression that it's made of something substantial, yet it's hoisted up there on a crane and attached to a facade. I suspect that that building, as I've seen buildings in New York very recently, being totally reclad because even the 4-inch brick veneer has failed over the last 40 or 50 years. But what they're doing is recladding it in an enclosure that in some cases is much more, it's like heavily insulated and has a rain screen that allows the building to breathe and dry, because moisture is the killer of a lot of the deterioration of buildings long term. So you can build in a sustainable way and recoup that in how much it costs to maintain that building by reducing heating and cooling costs too. And this is a trend that we'll be seeing a lot more of. Passive house, for instance, is one method of producing buildings where you can reduce heating and cooling costs by 90%, and therefore you can put that extra money up front. You just have to separate operating from construction costs. And trust me when I say that we're 20 years behind Europe in how they're doing things like that. They build for the long term. We build for the point where the developer is going to sell it and make his money. A big concern is we have millions and millions of square feet of warehouse being built, which will sustain themselves for the length of the first lease, when after 5 or 10 years they'll be paid for, and if they're empty at that point, people are just going to walk away. And that's an example of an optimized for the market building rather than optimized for long-term sustainability. There's going to be a lot of basketball and football sized buildings, sometimes many football sized buildings, that may not be of any value in the future, but they're serving the developer, and that's the ultimate example of where you put your money and for what reason. You're building these things because there's profit in them, and as soon as it's paid for, it's like everything else is gravy. And at that point, if there's no occupants, well, you've made your money. So you need to think of how you're investing and the duration you're investing for. And that's something that we need to somehow factor into the advice from these environmental advisory committees to understand that you need to build for something that can be adapted for a new use in the future. Like I said, a tough one.
Excellent. Thank you all. I've got a couple of variations of a question from an attendee, and it can best be summarized by smaller cities could learn a lot from Lancaster. And so the question is, how did you create such a slam dunk scenario for being such a small city? And they even reference in their various questions cities like Scranton, Erie, Youngstown, Trenton. So, what can other cities learn from what Lancaster, for example, has been able to accomplish?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Ultimately, I think collaboration and partnership is our secret sauce here in Lancaster. I've had the opportunity to live in other cities in the state and across the country where in many cases there's just an inability to work together. There's infighting between entities that really should be partners, and folks looking to take credit. I think a common ethos in our community is we don't care if we get the credit. We just want to see success. And I think I talked to this earlier. It's really the investment, not only financially, but time and energy wise by our private business community in this place. I think Lancaster is a very special place in that regard. Generally I would say, Lancaster City is a dot of blue in a sea of red, in the county, but typically we don't let politics get between us, and there seems to be a lot of across the aisle collaboration. Although I will say, as I think across the nation, we are starting to feel some of that polarization here, but so far it hasn't gotten in our way.
Yeah, let me just say that with regard to competition, one of the issues, again, and this relates to the planning laws in Pennsylvania, is every community is responsible for themselves and not their neighbor. So we see development happening that may impact the surrounding communities, yet their decisions are based on what's best for them. And from a regional standpoint, on the Planning Commission, we have no control over what happens to the adjoining communities when we do reviews, even though we know that the infrastructure may not accommodate the traffic from one area to another. And it's, I think it's critical to look at how developers are targeting, in some cases, very small communities, proposing things that may have a broad impact on the region, and yet the controls for that are minimal beyond the individual community. Buildings are getting bigger than communities.
Absolutely.
Thank you all. In line with Lancaster, here's another question for you, Jeremy. In Lancaster, why set an income goal that's only 70% of state average?
That's a great question. That's actually a question that we get quite a lot. That was what seems to many to be a sort of arbitrary number. And so we're not so much, we're keeping our eye on that goal. Lancaster City's per capita income is 70% of Pennsylvania's. But really, in addition to that, we're monitoring, what's the median household income? What's our poverty rate? And, I think growth or a decrease respectively, is really helping us to understand how incomes are changing.
Wonderful, thank you.
That was the number determined by our plan consultant.
All right. Can each of you talk about the role of the architect within the development team?
I might have a biased view of that, so I'll leave that to Darlene. Basically, we come to the table with a partner, and that would be the developer. And go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think the architect's role varies depending on who their client is. I think some clients bring the architect to the table pretty early, especially knowing that they're in a historic district and we've got some guidelines they're going to have to comply with. And there really is a greater understanding, I think, with some developers than with others. And so it's helpful to us, frankly, when the architect is at the table early and we can talk about, what works and what doesn't work on a certain block or in a certain district. That is extremely helpful to us. But the availability, I guess, of working with an architect is really up to the client, the property owner or the developer.
And needless to say, we will step in when we feel it's in the best interest of the client's goals to perform a certain way that both impacts the city positively and the developer positively. It's not a win-lose situation. Design is infinitely flexible. I think, as you've seen from the building in Lancaster that used to be a no-windowed department store that then turned into this incredibly well-adapted building with an existing substructure. And that's something that, developers are looking at the bottom line. They're looking at cost per square foot. Architects are the vehicle to get them to that goal and have it integrate well with the surroundings, because we have a much broader view of that. Fair enough, Jeremy?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Anything else, Michelle?
Great.
Or?
Yeah, we've got one more question, and it's on the topic of how other cities can do what you all are doing. And I'd like to first use this opportunity to plug our session 2 for this series, which is on October 28th, same time. And we're going to be featuring different cities than what you see here, cities that are even smaller than the ones we discussed today. That would include Pittston, Wilkes-Barre, Altoona, and Oil City, all in Pennsylvania. So you can check your chat box to get the link to where you can register for that on October 28th. So we'd love to see you there too. So the question is, do any of the speakers have advice for other small cities and towns across the Commonwealth that want to start their redevelopment efforts but are overwhelmed by the needs and status of their downtown? What is the first step?
So I'm a city planner. So for me, it starts with putting it out there in some kind of a plan, and a plan that has already received community input, where you know that the consensus of the committee or the community is reflected in that plan. And I think one of the things that we benefit from in Bethlehem is that there is a shared vision in the community about what we want our city to be. We know what our assets are, and we want to build on those. We often get a little bit tangled up with implementation. Sometimes, density is really a challenge. That's very controversial. Some people want to see more density in the city, and some people think that's not good for us. There's things that we still wrangle with. But I think you have to put it down on paper somehow. This is what we want our community to be. That honestly helps us to really apply for grants and other programs so that we're responsible for the public infrastructure to move forward our goals and objectives, and then we're also responsible to partner with the private sector on private development projects where we can. That's where, from a planner perspective, those are what I think the initiatives are initially. Your thoughts, Jeremy?
Absolutely. Yeah. In Lancaster, something that we really focused very early on, very early on was, creating a clean and safe environment that will attract new residents, new businesses, visitors, but also, creating a coalition of business leaders that are willing to work together to advance community goals. And really, that's something that we continue to do. But you have to listen to your community, number one.
Any input, Stephen?
I think I'm good with that. we can sort of wind it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we are at past the 12 o'clock mark, and we have covered nearly all the questions in the chat. So I'd really like to thank you all for joining today. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Darlene. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you to all the attendees who have come in today. Really appreciate the conversation. I'm sure we could talk about this for hours if we had the platform to do so. So I'm glad we got to start the conversation. Check the chat for that link to join us on October 28th. For the next session, we'll have different panelists, different questions, different cities up for discussion. So we hope to see you there. And there's a survey that's going to pop up at the end. Please take it. Let us know how you enjoyed the session, and we hope to see you on the next one. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Michelle.
Thanks.